Welcome to our series on the Westminster Confession of Faith. We are glad that you are here. Today we begin chapter 7, which is titled Of God's Covenant with Man. This chapter is one of the most foundational in the entire confession because it introduces the concept of covenant, the framework through which God relates to his creatures. In this first section, we will explore why covenant is necessary. What is it about the relationship between God and humanity that requires God to come to us, rather than the other way around? The answer lies in the vast distance between the Creator and the creature, a distance that no amount of human effort could ever bridge. In chapter 6, we explored the devastating effects of the fall, how Adam's first sin plunged all of humanity into a state of sin and misery. Now chapter 7 turns from the problem to God's answer, and that answer is covenant. But before we look at the specific covenants, the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, section 1 asks an even more fundamental question. Why is covenant necessary in the first place? And the answer the confession gives may surprise us. The need for covenant does not begin with the fall. It begins with the very nature of God and the nature of the creature. Even in the Garden of Eden, before any sin had entered the world, there was an infinite distance between the Creator and the creature, a distance that no human effort could ever bridge. That is where our study begins today. Let us now read the text of Westminster Confession, chapter 7, section 1. The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their Creator, yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he hath been pleased to express by way of covenant. The confession opens with what might seem like an abstract theological statement, but it is actually deeply practical. It tells us that the distance between God and the creature is so great that no creature could ever bridge it. Think about what this means. God is infinite, without limit in his being, knowledge, and power. He is eternal, without beginning or end. He is unchangeable, never growing, never diminishing. We, on the other hand, are finite. We are bound by time. We change and decay. The gap between creator and creature is not merely large, it is infinite. And this is not a problem introduced by sin. Even in the Garden of Eden, with Adam and Eve in a state of perfect innocence, the creator-creature distinction remained. God was still infinite, and they were still finite. As the psalmist puts it, "Who is like the Lord our God, who is seated on high, who looks far down on the heavens and the earth?" The very heavens are beneath him. This is the starting point the confession establishes, and everything else in this chapter flows from it. Notice the word the confession uses. Reasonable creatures do owe obedience, not may choose to obey or are invited to obey, but owe. This is a debt that exists simply because God made us. Robert Shaw, in his exposition of the Westminster Confession, puts it plainly: man is naturally and necessarily under a law to God, which results from the unalterable relation between creator and creature. This means that obedience is not something extra we offer to God. It is the bare minimum of what we owe him. And even if someone could obey God perfectly for an entire lifetime, never a single failure, never a single shortcoming, that person would still have no grounds to claim a reward. Perfect obedience is simply what a creature owes its Creator. Jesus makes this point unmistakably in Luke chapter 17. So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, "We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty." This is a humbling truth. We can never put God in our debt by our obedience, because obedience is already what we owe. The confession says that creatures could never have any fruition of God, any enjoyment of him as their blessedness and reward, apart from his voluntary condescension. The word fruition is rich. It means not just knowing about God, but truly enjoying him, delighting in him, finding your ultimate happiness in him. And the confession tells us plainly, that is something no creature could ever achieve on its own. Why? Because our obedience adds nothing to God. Elihu in the book of Job asks the question directly, "If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand?" The answer is nothing. God is entirely self-sufficient. He does not need our worship. our obedience, or our service. As Paul told the Athenians, God is not served by human hands as though he needed anything. Robert Shaw explains this pointedly in his exposition. God could have demanded all possible obedience from man without ever making any promise at all. Even after a lifetime of perfect obedience, man could not have laid his Creator under any obligation. God would have owed him nothing. Now we come to the heart of the section, the phrase voluntary condescension. These two words carry enormous theological weight. First, it is voluntary. God was under no compulsion. Nothing in his nature or in ours required him to do more than simply rule over us as our Creator and Judge. He could have remained transcendent and distant, demanding obedience while offering nothing in return, and he would have been entirely just in doing so. But second, it is condescension. God chose to stoop. He chose to draw near. He chose to make himself available, not because he needed to, but because he is gracious. Berkhoff emphasizes that when God establishes a covenant with man, the initiative is entirely his. God is the sovereign who imposes his ordinances upon his creatures, but he does so in love. Think about what the confession is saying. The God who made everything, who is Lord of heaven and earth, who needs nothing from human hands, that God chose to bind himself to us. He chose to make promises. He chose to offer himself as our blessedness and reward. That is condescension beyond anything we could ask for or imagine. The confession tells us that God has been pleased to express this condescension by way of covenant. But what exactly is a covenant? In the Reformed tradition, a covenant is understood as a binding arrangement between God and man, in which God sets the terms and makes the promises. It is not a negotiation between equals. God is the one who initiates, who defines the conditions, and who pledges the rewards. Man is the recipient. Robert Shaw, drawing on the Dutch Reformed theologian Witzius, explains the significance of this beautifully. Without covenant, a creature might obey God perfectly and still have no claim on any blessing. But through covenant, God binds himself. He makes promises. And because God is faithful to his own word, those promises become something his people can depend on absolutely. Shaw writes that by accepting the covenant and performing its condition, man acquires some right to the promise, not because God needs to give anything, but because God has freely chosen to pledge himself. This is what makes covenant so extraordinary. The infinite God, who owes us nothing, has placed himself under obligation by his own goodness, justice, and truthfulness. So why does all of this matter? Why does the confession begin its discussion of covenant with this seemingly abstract point about the creator-creature distinction? Because everything else depends on it. If God had not condescended to enter into covenant, we would still owe him everything, every breath, every thought, every act of obedience. But we would have no promise of blessing in return. We would have duty, but no hope, obligation, but no reward. Covenant changes everything. It is the framework through which God offers life, salvation, and fellowship to his creatures. As Berkhoff explains, covenant is the thread that runs through all of God's dealings with humanity. From the first covenant with Adam in the garden, through the promises to Abraham, through the law given at Sinai, all the way to the new covenant sealed in the blood of Christ. And here is the practical comfort. If your relationship with God depended on your performance, you would have no assurance at all. But because God has bound himself by covenant, your hope rests not on what you have done, but on what he has promised. Every comfort in the Christian life, forgiveness, adoption, perseverance, glorification, flows from God's covenant faithfulness. That is why the confession begins here. That is why the covenant matters. Here are 3 questions for discussion. Question 1. Why does the confession begin its treatment of covenant by emphasizing the distance between God and the creature? A good answer would note that without understanding the creator-creature distinction, we cannot appreciate the marvel of covenant. Covenant is not God meeting us halfway. It is God stooping all the way down. Starting here prevents us from thinking we can approach God on our own terms. Question 2. How does the idea of voluntary condescension shape the way we think about prayer, worship, and our relationship with God? This should lead to reflections on humility and gratitude. If God condescends to hear our prayers, then prayer is always a gift, not a right. If God condescends to accept our worship, then worship is an act of grace, not an achievement. Every aspect of our relationship with God is made possible by His choice to draw near. Question 3. If perfect obedience is simply our duty and cannot earn reward, what does that tell us about every blessing we receive from God? The answer is that every blessing is a gift of grace. We cannot earn anything from God. Even the good things we do are simply what we owe. So every blessing we receive, forgiveness, fellowship, eternal life, comes not from our merit, but from God's free and gracious promise in covenant. Let us review what we have learned today from Westminster Confession, Chapter 7, Section 1. First, the distance between God and the creature is infinite. God is the eternal, self-sufficient creator, and we are finite, dependent creatures. No amount of human effort can close that gap. Second, as creatures, we owe God total obedience. But even perfect obedience is simply our duty. It earns no claim on any blessing or reward. Third, God freely condescended to enter into covenant. He was under no obligation to do so, but in His grace He chose to bind Himself by promise. Fourth, covenant gives creatures what they could never have on their own, a real basis for fellowship with God, for hope, and for the enjoyment of God as their blessedness and reward. And finally, this means that every blessing in the Christian life flows from God's covenant faithfulness, not from our performance. Our hope rests on His promise, not on our obedience. Next time, we will look at Westminster Confession 7.2, which introduces the first covenant God made with man, the covenant of works. In that covenant, life was promised to Adam, and in him to all his descendants, upon the condition of perfect and personal obedience. We will explore what that covenant involved and what it means for us today.